up on the docket?
Okay, well, I guess we could dive into kind of maybe a little talk about the economy if you're down. There's a couple things that have happened recently. First off, the Republicans actually are talking about some form of a bipartisan compromise for Biden's infrastructure plan, where they're saying they'd be willing to talk about $1 trillion, and there might be actually a vote on that on Thursday. Also, the jobs report from April predicted 1 million new jobs. There was only about 20, I think it was 2,000 or 266,000. That's what it was. So only about more or less a quarter of what was projected. The right wing is saying inflation's coming next, everything's going to shit. The left is saying inflation will just be temporary, the economy's just getting going, and Biden's just kind of in the fray with this, man. So yeah, there's definitely a lot going on with that.
Yeah, there is. I tend to be I think a little more optimistic. I do think the worry about inflation is valid. If you look at government spending and the way that the Federal Reserve is printing money to keep our economy afloat. However, I do think that the worry about inflation should have been consistent through the pandemic. I think now it's weird. It's just a little weird that like this conversation was not had on the right, even when Trump was passing $1 trillion stimulus packages, and then now that Biden's doing it, suddenly inflation is this boogeyman. I think inflation is an issue that we people should keep an eye on. But from what I'm gathering, is that the Federal Reserve doesn't believe it to be a huge issue. They haven't changed rates much. They've seems to fill the economic hole, at least in the financial markets, from the COVID crash pretty quickly. And so, while I do understand the concerns over inflation and certainly prices of goods is rising, I think anecdotally, if you talk to people, there's a big rise in prices. But I think that a lot has to do with an increase in demand. I think the COVID, recession is kind of over, so there's increased demand for things. And as the supply is still behind at full potential, coming back into like manufacturing and especially in like microchips and technology, the prices will eventually even out. I think a little bit more. I think the worry about inflation is overhyped to scare people off of government spending, whereas it should not prevent government spending. It should just be maintained and kept a look at. And of course, um, the Federal Reserve should just keep an eye on it. If you trust them, most people don't, but they seem to do pretty well the last year.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. I'm also hesitant to really honestly pass any judgment at this time on this, just because like it's just really hard to know. Like you said, we were in basically like a government mandated recession in a lot of ways. Well, a government mandated shutdown that in some ways led to a recession. And so yeah, I mean it's inevitable that things are going to be kind of slow off the gate once this has happened. And if you could bear with me for just a second, I listened last week to the New York Times Daily that had a great discussion with this Ben Castleman guy who's an economic reporter and expert from the Times. And he talks about how, it's like kind of what we've both said is it's really just hard to tell right now. He jokes to check back in 6 months, to see where we're at that point. But he uses these kind of three theories on why the economy is. And real briefly, I'm just going to touch on them because I think they're actually interesting and they might paint why this is happening. The first theory is that the job growth was weaker because the recovery was weaker. He says we're like a car trying to get to top speed, but we aren't on the highway yet. So like instead we're just still on the access road. So you're just not to top speed yet. It's you're not driving 80 miles an hour down the highway. Well, I guess I drive 80 miles, but maybe some people don't. But and his second theory is that we're getting up to speed, but we're still in the merge moment where like there's a shit ton of cars on the highway and yeah, we're ready to get moving, but when there's a lot of traffic, it's hard to just jump on and get back going.
Yeah.
And that's his point is like it's tough to hire quickly because people are still hesitant for like such a myriad of different reasons. So it's going to be a slow recovery. But then the third theory, which I actually think is also more the conservative argument, and I do understand it, is that we're already on the highway but we're trying to jam the accelerator too much. And basically, going with that metaphor, we're just trying to put too much money in the system at once, and it's going to overload everything. Because I think some of Biden's plans, Trump should have done a year ago. Like Biden came into office at a great opportune time for the vaccine and for a lot of this recovery, but it's almost like, to be honest, we needed Biden a year ago. to be more willing to do some of these things back then. And so now it's kind of like, okay, we're giving people money. The economy's already bouncing back in some ways, and we're still talking about more spending plans. Like maybe it's too much on the gas right now. And I don't really have a theory of which one I agree with, but I think it's just interesting to point out that it's either a slow recovery, the fact that we're just getting up to speed in the recovery, or maybe we did put too much money in, and maybe it's all three. I don't know.
I To those that say that this too much government spending um, will somehow pull us back into the economy of last year, uh, based on what?
You're asking me?
Yeah, or well, I mean, if you want to play the devil's advocate, I don't know if you believe this, but I mean,
No, yeah.
I just don't like. What's the evidence for that? Like, what's the evidence?
Okay. Well, it's again because we're not far enough out. It's all more speculative from economists who are either left or right, basically, right? But there is kind of this paradox, which or not paradox, more just a self fulfilling prophecy. Meaning, say someone goes to the store and sees, say, poultry prices are higher or hotel prices are higher if they're trying to get away for the weekend. They're going to go to their boss and demand a higher wage because they can't afford what they could afford a year ago. And then market prices again have to now react to that. So now, then at the supermarket, just based on economic indicators, they would then probably raise their prices again. But this is going off of again like a normal crisis, and I want to make that very clear. Like this is not a normal crisis that's happened in the U.S. It was again a government mandated shutdown that forced people to stay home and forced a lot of these companies to just diminish what they're doing. And so I do buy into it mainly that it's going to be short-sighted demand issues and short-sighted
Right.
inflation, mainly because people are traveling.
That's what I think it is. I mean, that's what gas prices are high. Gas
Right.
prices are high because the COVID crash also coincided with an oil crash. Like oil was already crashing, and
Mhm.
then COVID happened. There was even less demand for oil because there was no cruises, no flights, and people weren't driving. All of those things are coming back very quickly, which is causing to a mass increase in demand for oil. So oil prices have skyrocketed back, and gas prices have skyrocketed back because the demand is increasing rapidly. That's the second theory, which is everyone's trying to get on the freeway. It's just jammed up a little bit. It's taking it a little bit slower. I tend to buy that a little bit more as an explanation as to why prices are increasing, why there's a lag in the economy, why there's a slow hiring, why there's people are trying to hire and they can't figure like they can't fill jobs because I think like like so many people are going back or there's also people have been getting unemployment for a while and want to find something better than $15 an hour. There's a vast demand for a wage increase. um, that is more likely, like that explains more to me than the idea that, well, Biden is spending so much and because of that we are seeing a lag. I don't buy that argument. I can see how Biden spending might increase inflation in a few years. Like I can see that, but that's not unlike any other time when massive government spending has been used to pull people out of a recession. And if anything, I think if you look at Obama's actions after the 2008 recession, I would personally argue we should have spent more. And I think that's what Biden
Mhm.
is doing.
No, absolutely. No, I would probably go more your direction on that as well. You know, I also think, I mean, we talked about this when the pandemic started, how pandemics historically do seem to change countries, they change societies. And there's sometimes some good takes out of it. I mean, they talk about how the Black Plague was kind of what I guess exasperated inequality to the point where they actually started looking at more equitable programs and the idea of paying people wages,
Hmm.
which seems now mundane, but back then that would be something huge. And to me, it seems like yeah, Biden is spending a shit ton of money in relation to any other president before this. But again, maybe the pandemic was just kind of the nail in the coffin for kind of an outdated economic system. Like we are behind most of the world. I was reading in The Economist. I think it was just us in Papua New Guinea who don't have like paid maternity leave, who
Right.
who don't have. I mean, we're one of the only countries that doesn't have a public option for healthcare. Like to me, it's like I wish we could just get rid of the word socialism. Because Biden isn't a socialist. To me, like where a lot of the people in his administration are going is kind of Scandinavian capitalism, the Nordic model, democratic socialism in a lot of ways, and they just want more robust safety nets with more robust public infrastructure, but also a free market. and that's going to take some spending. And I think like maybe there's a zeitgeist changed on the left that is happening right now, because it does seem like these programs are popular not just with Democrats but also with Republicans, except for healthcare. But the other ones, they're actually pretty like evenly popular with both sides. So to me, it seems like most Americans realize that maybe throwing more money into the problem is necessary. But I think now we're seeing a backlash from the right and kind of the 20th century economists more, who are used to kind of the status quo and what we used to take as fact.
I also think it's worth noting the shift like what you said is like what people find popular. One of them, I think the one you were referencing, is infrastructure. I think infrastructure is something that if you just say, should we invest more in infrastructure, I think most Americans agree. I would have said yes under Trump. I did. I remember when Trump mentioned infrastructure. I hope he did it. He didn't. I'm equally excited about infrastructure for Biden. I don't care who does it. I think we do need to revamp infrastructure. But that's one of those things where I think there's a shift in the focus on how to get us out of COVID. I think you're right. Like maybe if we're coming to the end of this year, still talking about direct payments, maybe it is time to like shift from talking about direct payments to more how do we reopen and reopen well with investing in new infrastructure and investing in infrastructure for EVs. I think that's where the administration's going. I think that's what this new fight in Congress is about, the infrastructure bill. And I think that is a good way to solve the problem of the economy, the slow economy coming out of COVID, is invest in infrastructure. Um, and but it's proving to be politically challenging. Originally it was something like $2 trillion is what Biden proposed. They had to cut back 500 billion of it. Republicans proposed a counteroffer of only 500 billion, so 25% of what Biden wanted. There's talks about revamps to the VA that has to get cut. Talks about research and development that Republicans want to cut. There's a big political battle going on, and um, but I think that Biden needs to get a win. I think that one is, I think, it's something that I think could be very politically advantageous if he gets a big infrastructure bill from both sides. But two, if he doesn't get an infrastructure bill, and I think it looks really bad, and I think was supposed to be one of his more important objectives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, just before we started recording, I'm reading something off of Bloomberg, excuse me, here, that says the GOP are going to be offering Biden nearly 1 trillion for infrastructure plans.
Okay, so they've upped it.
And they have. Like, I do think that, again, Mitch McConnell and some of the guys like him are pragmatic in the approach that I'm sure he understands that they need to get something passed as much as Biden understands they need to get something passed.
Right.
The House is crazy. The House is crazy. The Republicans in the House, I think some of them are beyond any repair, but there are senators that I think are willing to compromise. But the problem is, to me, there's a huge disconnect in the fact that the Republicans have become these faux populists where they're the men of the people, men and women of the people. And in reality, how Biden wants to pay for this is his corporate and wealthy tax hikes. Like if you're making over 400 grand a year, they're going to raise your taxes to pay for this. They're going to raise corporate taxes. And the Republicans want to tax average people that are using the new infrastructure. They want to tax people that are driving on these bridges, these toll roads, etc. And again, that's the disconnect, is the supposed party of the people that Trump, had this whole thing he was doing. They again aren't willing to help the people, and again they're kind of country club, out of touch Republicans still. And that's the big issue with this infrastructure bill, is that the Republicans don't want to raise any taxes on that 1% or on corporations, and it's going to be really tough when. The one thing I've actually liked about the Biden administration is I don't agree with some of the economics of, like, say, that global corpus tax rate and how that would work. But the fact that they're talking about doing something and they actually have a plan instead of just Trump's endless spending with really no good economics behind them, to me it's nice to see. But again, the Republican Party doesn't seem to care about spending anymore. And so to me, that's the game of chicken we're seeing, is like, who's going to budge first on how we pay for this? And then there's, the parliamentarian option for budget reconciliation. And I've actually heard some reports that maybe Biden's being counseled by advisors and friends that he should just settle with some kind of milquetoast compromise, but then later use budget reconciliation for a more in scope infrastructure plan. again, like they only get three, as far as I'm concerned, a year of budget reconciliation, and they've already been quite gung ho with it. So I don't know if they want to keep going down that
Can
route.
you can
But
you can you
yeah,
explain a little bit what that is, budget reconciliation?
yes. So it's basically this kind of weird system where they can, let me articulate this better, is that basically what they do is they skip the filibuster and skip deliberation to the point where basically what they do is, so with having a small majority in the House and the Senate, Democratic leaders can basically use this special process, which is called the reconciliation, to just quickly advance this high priority fiscal legislation. And it was created by the Congressional Budget Act. I think it was in the mid '70s, and it basically expedites this. But it can only be used for budgets and debt limits and spending and tax bills. And so basically, they can skip the filibuster and they have someone called the parliamentarian who could help them speed it through. But they're only allowed three of these during the year just because of, the idea of democracy and discussion. They can't do it all the time.
Right.
But what their goal basically would be is that if you have a very simple majority, and we're talking about razor thin edge, they can basically use the parliamentarian who is not in Congress and who from what I've gathered, and believe me, I'm not an expert on this. That is someone who is outside of the democratic system who is involved in this, who was appointed. I correct me if I'm wrong on that, listeners, but I believe that's what happens, and this person then can approve it. But it's a slippery slope. They don't do it very often, and I don't know if that's how you want to keep legislating. Kind of similar as packing the courts and getting rid of the filibuster. It might work in the short term, but the long term kind of scares me. But it does, like, my two remedies, just really fast, would be either do a compromise now, just to maybe bring some sanity in the country of some resemblance of bipartisanship, and then later use it to pass more extreme measures, or just pass these bipartisan bills as they go. But it's still hard because there are a few bipartisan bills. Like the House agreed. The Senate agreed on a anti-Asian hate crime bill. They've agreed on basically kind of a somewhat nationalist, bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S. So we're not relying on Taiwan for almost all of it.
Sweet.
Like there's some things we agree on, right? But like the problem is like this infrastructure bill right now in its current stage has so much in it that you're not going to find both sides to agree on it ever.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes, and that's why there's this interesting issue of like there's all this talk about this bipartisanship on an infrastructure bill, and I agree there should be, but I don't think it's going to happen to the point in which we want. Like at a certain point, it seems like Biden has signaled that he wants to have bipartisanship, but he will go on without it if Republicans don't want to play ball, then he'll just focus on getting Democrats. So we'll see. In which Democrats might be easier to sway than Republicans, and at least to get something through. But it should be interesting. I certainly think we need an infrastructure bill, and not just roads and bridges, but also like I think one is a big is the EV infrastructure. I think that's the way the winds of change are going towards electric vehicles, and I think a good one to push that along to help reduce emissions is to build as many charging stations as you would a gas station, right? Make it so that it's not a hassle, or you don't have to be a homeowner to own a Tesla or to own any kind of EV, right? You should be able to charge them pretty availably, and as the technology gets better and the infrastructure gets better, I imagine within 10, 20 years you won't have an issue at all about charging your EV or the running out of range or whatever. And so I think get advancing that infrastructure, advancing especially green infrastructure is super cool and important, and puts people to work, makes jobs. People have to build those, and I think it's a good thing. So I hope we see more bipartisanship, because I think infrastructure is something that everyone can get behind. It's literally building our country back. It's building our country.
Absolutely. And just the last thing I will just add to that is that it, like, with Biden's stimulus economic relief package that he passed a couple months ago, they pulled, the Bulwark guys were talking about it. I forget the specific poll, but they were polling voters in the Midwest, Republican voters, who thought that the Republicans actually voted to pass the stimulus bill.
Yeah.
And because it was popular with a lot of, like, more, I would say, a lot more independent or center right voters. It was very popular with them. I don't know if you're ever going to appease the QAnon people, to be completely honest. But so I'm worried again that Republicans can just keep going against this, keep fighting it, And even if it somehow passes through budget reconciliation, they can again play the faux, hey, we supported this, because it's a weird thing where the Republicans basically can just try to stop these policies, but then when they pass, they can still campaign on them at home.
Yeah,
And
they
I'm
can
I'm
tout
worried they're
them.
going to do that. Yeah, I'm worried they're going to do that again.